Let's begin. Welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Humanities. Gives me great pleasure to welcome you on what is in Vancouver, at least, a gorgeous sunny day. So those of you who are in and around Vancouver, I really appreciate you being by a device of some kind and zoomed in to us for this lecture by Bryan Smyth. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'd also like to say that we're kind of winding down after quite a busy month. I mean, May has been incredibly busy, but extremely rewarding. We've had a number of terrific talks, and this is the final one for the month. What will happen next is I'm just going to introduce my very good friend and colleague, Ian Angus, who is going to moderate our event for this evening. Before I do, I'd just like to remind you that at Institute events, we really welcome and value and treasure discussion, comments, questions, and I think we have a pretty good reputation for the very high quality of discussion that we see in virtually all of our events, I think. So we'd like to encourage that, but I'd just like to also remind you to please put your comments in the Q&A section. Often there are various other kinds of comments about things to read or definitions of terms and so on that we see in the chat section, which is great. We encourage that. It's wonderful. People, talk amongst themselves, and we'd also encourage that. But we want to keep the questions in the Q&A, which will be then easier for the moderator to go through and select it. In this case, obviously, it'll be Ian Angus, who can then read the questions out to our speaker. And this is important because this event is being recorded. And if we just pointed the speaker to the questions, which would be a little bit difficult anyways. I mean, there's a lot of things going on when you're trying to give a talk and think about answering questions. So Ian will read them out. So make sure you get them in there if you want your questions addressed. So without any further ado, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Ian Angus, who is a professor emeritus in the Department of Humanities here at SFU. It's published widely in areas of contemporary philosophy, Canadian studies, and communication theory, several books and articles and views and so on. I'm very pleased to have co-edited with our mutual friend Payman Vahabzadeh this festschrift on his work, which came out last year. It's called Crossing Borders, Essays in Honor of Ian Angus Beyond Phenomenology and Critique, and that was with Arbeiter Ring. Just because there's a festschrift doesn't mean that the work is done, as Ian constantly reminds me, and is obviously true insofar as he's got a new book coming out, and it's a big, thick one, he tells me, and that's called Groundwork of Phenomenological Marxism, Crisis, Body, World, and that's going to be with Lexington Books. We're going to be doing a launch on that at some point in the near future. I'm very excited about that. So I'm just going to turn it over to Ian to continue the proceedings. Ian, welcome.
Thank you, Samir. I would first begin by acknowledging that the Institute for the Humanities that is hosting this event, it lies on the traditional and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish First Nations. I would like to just take a moment to introduce you to Bryan Smyth and his work. Bryan has a PhD from McGill University, and he's taught philosophy at the University of Mississippi since 2013. His research deals primarily with phenomenology and critical theory and how these traditions intersect with regards to nature and history. He published Merleau-Ponty's Existential Phenomenology and the Realization of Philosophy in 2014 with Bloomsbury, and is working on a follow-up volume entitled Hyperdialectical Materialism, Nature and History in Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology. His annotated translation of Merleau-Ponty's Le Monde Sensible et Le Monde de l'Expression appeared in 2020 from Northwestern, and he is currently translating its companion volume, Recherche sur l'usage littéraire du langage. He is co-editing a volume of new essays on phenomenology and Marxism with Lexington Press, and preparing a monograph entitled Incarnating the Good, Rethinking Heroism as an Embodied Phenomenon. He's president of the Society for Existential and Phenomenological Theory and Culture, where we've worked together for a number of years, and he serves on the editorial board of Heroism Studies and is critical theory reviews editor for Symposium. Bryan has been publishing a number of works on Merleau-Ponty's late conceptions of history, which I take it is probably part of his new projected work on Merleau-Ponty. This work is extremely interesting, and that's why we've invited him to join us tonight. So please, and before I go, let me underline what Samir said. Please use the question and answer section to ask questions, and I'll read them out at the end. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Bryan Smyth.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Samir, and thanks to the Institute and its co-sponsors for enabling me to give this talk today. So my talk today is about Merleau-Ponty and nature, and how this might be related to what is nowadays referred to as big history or deep history. This connection is not meant as one among many that might be drawn, but as indicating the basic sense of Merleau-Ponty's interest in nature. As is probably the case with any talk purporting to deal with history and nature, there is quite a bit involved in this, and so I will be cutting some corners and giving some aspects short shrift, or even none at all. Hopefully, it still makes sufficient sense to you to be able to form a judgment about it. The main upshot of what I will have to say will be to suggest that valuable heuristic insights for contemporary critical social theory may be gleaned from the phenomenological interrogation of nature that Merleau-Ponty undertook in a series of lecture courses that he gave at the Collège de France in the mid to late 1950s. These insights concern the normative grounds of immanent social critique and the possibility of understanding historically transformative agency in embodied terms. And they do so in a way that comes with a sort of epistemic cautionary tale with regard to identifying that normativity. So, my remarks will fall into three sections. It's sort of a simple sandwich. First, I'll lay out some contextual points to help set things up. These are broad brushstrokes, and hopefully any gaps can be addressed afterwards. I'll then discuss some representative points from Merleau-Ponty's work on nature. These will concern animality. And finally, I'll elaborate the implications I just referred to. It's important to know that the textual basis of Merleau-Ponty's nature lectures is less than ideal, comprised largely of student notes along with brief preparatory notes from Merleau-Ponty himself. So while it does form the filling of the sandwich, it needs to be served between relatively thick slices of contextualization and interpretation. So first, background and context. Maurice Merleau-Ponty was a French phenomenological philosopher who was active relatively briefly from the late 1930s until his untimely death in 1961. With his phenomenology of perception, he was among the first in France to take up Husserlian phenomenology in a big way, reinterpreting it by way of an existential focus on embodiment, which is probably what he is best known for, and which, among other sources, drew heavily on the holistic or organismic biology of Kurt Goldstein. He also regarded phenomenology as theoretically and practically complementary to Marxism, and he was interested in developing this connection most explicitly in the early post-war years. Now, the intellectual atmosphere in post-war France was, to a very significant extent, shaped by questions concerning Marxism, to which was linked the fact that the French tradition of engagement, the pressure felt especially by progressively minded intellectuals to be politically engaged, all but implied some degree of sympathy for the French Communist Party and the USSR. And with the onset of the Cold War, this was reinforced by the heavy imposition of Zdanovism, the official Soviet ideology of two diametrically opposed camps that aimed to squeeze out any middle ground. Although himself a non-conforming sympathizer, Merleau-Ponty was thus part of the generation of French intellectuals harshly criticized by historian Tony Judd in his book Past Imperfect, for example, for what he regarded as their politically naive and morally irresponsible tolerance for, or even defense of, Stalinism and its totalitarian violence. Notwithstanding his well-known attempts in Humanism and Terror to uphold the possible legitimacy of revolutionary violence, and in particular even to defend the conceivability of defending the 1938 show trial of Nicolas Boucarin, Merleau-Ponty was not really a central figure in Judd's crosshairs. This may be right, but not necessarily for right reasons. Along with most commentators, including Merleau-Ponty specialists, Judd would say that by, say, the early 1950s, Merleau-Ponty basically came to his senses and disavowed Marxism altogether, whereas I would contend that his interest in revisioning Marxism along phenomenological lines remained steady, but took a philosophically deeper form that led him outside the recognizable terms of the discussion. This had to do with the question of nature. A second broad point, Merleau-Ponty always had a serious philosophical interest in nature and humanity's relation to it. His first book, The Structure of Behavior, written toward the end of the 1930s, considered the problem of the relation between consciousness and nature and showed the inadequacy of standard conceptions of nature, whether empirical or idealist, with regard to overcoming dualism. But he couldn't yet give a more adequate answer, which would require some kind of naturalization of consciousness. With his turn to phenomenology anchored in embodied experience, Merleau-Ponty definitely set himself on the right track, for embodiment is the hinge between consciousness and nature, and disclosing the intentional structure of our pre-reflective being in the world, or as Merleau-Ponty often put it, our gearing together with the world, probably offers the most auspicious way to approach the problem. But for two overlapping reasons, this remained half-baked. First, phenomenology, as Merleau-Ponty took it up, which was along the lines of Husserl's late turn to the Lebenswelt, or pre-scientific life world, was not methodologically suited for investigating nature, at least in as much as this is understood in non-human terms. For it is not clear how it could be brought to any kind of genuine phenomenological givenness. Merleau-Ponty basically admitted that the phenomenological reduction was necessarily incomplete in this sense, that it could not bracket out the terms of our embodiment altogether. One could therefore never adopt the ideal standpoint of an outside spectator with regard to one's own life world. This could be seen as profoundly unacceptable or even devastating for phenomenology, inasmuch as it would ultimately leave it in a position of uncritical naivete with regard to the intentionalities underlying our lived experience. What enabled Merleau-Ponty to roll with this was that the problem seemed to be taken care of by the movement of history itself, in a way reminiscent of others. Here, I would just mention Georg Lukács writing in the aftermath of 1917, change was in the air. With the memory and momentum of the resistance, there was a popular appetite for progressive change, such that transformative agency seemed actual in a way that would make it okay not to fret over its possibility. And in this way, the incompleteness of the reduction could be made up for. It was as if the life world just was in question and didn't need to be put into question. But this situation didn't last. Now, overlapping with this, the second reason why Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of embodiment remained half-baked was that in the context of hashing out new intellectual foundations for post-war France, humanism, losing my track of my, humanism was the order of the day. Virtually everyone was working within the general framework of humanism, and much of the discussion had to do with coming to terms with Marx's then recently published 1844 manuscripts. For his part, Merleau-Ponty was trying to develop an existential, phenomenological Marxist humanism. He intended this as an alternative to Stalinist Marxism in particular, and the not terribly compelling humanist vision that it offered. And nature just wasn't on the agenda. Or rather, it was decidedly off the agenda due to its seeming complicity with Stalinism. At the time, and this is still largely true, the idea of a Marxist take on nature pointed at Friedrich Engels, in particular his books Anti-Düring and the posthumously published Dialectics of Nature. This work of Engels was intrinsically problematic in a number of ways, but the biggest problem was extrinsic, the fact that it had been thoroughly co-opted by Stalinism. The official ideological grounding of historical materialism in dialectical materialism lent strong credence to the view that Engels' work on nature was somehow, at least partly, responsible for the reductiveness of Stalinist ideology and its seemingly radical deviation from the seemingly much more agreeable humanism of Marx's manuscripts. In this way, Merleau-Ponty was drawn to Lukács, who, in History and Class Consciousness, and thus several years in advance of the publication of those manuscripts, had dismissed Engels' attempt to view nature in dialectical terms, and more generally rejected the need for Marxism to apply itself to nature, or more to the point, the viability of it doing so. In this way, we can say that following the war, Merleau-Ponty was originally situated within the terms of so-called Western Marxism. Pointing back to Lukács, this tradition is usually thought of in terms of the need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of social and political consciousness than classical Marxism had to offer. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. But for no essential reason, it was also premised on Lukács' rejection of Engels' approach to nature. There was an assumption to the effect that any concession to scientific naturalism, especially with regard to consciousness, would lead to an ideologically reified or simply undialectical scientism. In his haste to respond relevantly to the immediate political exigencies of the post-war period, Merleau-Ponty shared this assumption and uncritically embraced that rejection. Whatever may have been the case for Engels in the late 19th century, in the mid-20th century, there seemed to be no need to turn to nature in order to ground the revolutionary politics implied by Marx's critique of political economy. And moreover, it looked like a serious political liability to do so. However, it's not hard to see the problem this led to for Merleau-Ponty in both turning to the body and turning against nature in his opposition to Stalinism. His initial formulation of a phenomenological Marxism was fundamentally working at cross purposes. In effect, he was limiting his own innovative contribution by tying it to one side of a dead-end debate between a reductive view of nature and the denial of that view. Another way of expressing this would be to say that the overarching context of humanism at the time was one of Prometheanism. This could take different forms, from messianism and vanguardism to ostensibly self-emancipation. But in whatever form, Promethean humanism is always a humanism from above. It always involves the triumph of history over nature. There is a gesture of disidentification from nature, such the sense of historical progress is always a matter of further distanciation from nature. There is an implicit teleology in which the future pulls from above, the past doesn't push from below. It is effectively disembodied. There is no imminent fecundity. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological account of embodiment was thus an important step forward, but despite itself, it remained Promethean in this way. And so in it, the body was more a force of conservatism than revolution. Merleau-Ponty did appreciate the need for a non-Promethean humanism, but it was only belatedly that he realized that it called for a relativization of the distinction between nature and history, roughly, although not explicitly, along the lines of the Adornian notion of Naturgeschichte, nature, which I'll render as nature history, and the possibility it affords, as Adorno had put it, of, quote, interpreting concrete history as nature and making nature dialectical under the aspect of history. Combined with an orientation toward embodiment, this meant reprising Engels' approach to nature and natural dialecticity, or more specifically, extending it to biology, an area that Engels had, for the most part, deliberately left out of his account due to the underdeveloped state of the science at the time. In effect, then, the problem with Marxism was that natural dialecticity was sought in inorganic nature. The salience with regard to history of whatever might be identified there, the transformation of quality into quantity, for example, was at best trivial, while the historically relevant sense of dialecticity, interaction between subject and object, is to be found, if anywhere in nature, in the philo and ontogenetic development of organisms. What Merleau-Ponty needed to do then was historicize and generalize Goldstein's organismic biology. Final contextual point. This concerns deep history or big history. This denotes the transdisciplinary project popularized by historians like David Christian, holding up his book, that seeks to rehabilitate universal history, not simply by doing world history, but by pushing the historical narrative back at least to the primal scenario of hominization, if not all the way to the Big Bang. I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, but I will just note that this sort of undertaking is, at least in a superficial sense, a kind of nature history, and that as such, I find it mildly salutary, even if also somewhat thin, possibly unavoidably so, in terms of theoretical substance. Now, how scholarly work like this might be even mildly salutary, even while theoretically insubstantial, would have to do with its normative implications. The idea is that deep history has unifying intentions. In the wake of postmodern incredulity vis-a-vis so-called grand narratives, and their tendency to dress up ethnocentrism in the guise of universalism, deep history addresses the worry that particularity in historiography tends conversely to over-accentuate difference at the expense of what is common. It thus responds to a felt need for a broader, more inclusive framework that could serve as the background against which differences could be regarded in a new light. As William McNeill once expressed the sentiment, it would be an ecumenical history, his term, that still leaves, quote, plenty of room for human diversity in all its complexity. The implicit thought here is that what's wrong with grand narratives is that they aspire to universality within limited frameworks, such that the underlying problem wasn't their grandness, but on the contrary, that they were insufficiently grand. Rather than retrench the scope of historical inquiry, then, it should be radically widened to include humanity's deeper historical origins. Of course, to speak of origins can still sound pretty dubious, but this is why McNeill was insistent that this ecumenical history must be accompanied by a corresponding epistemic shift away from narrow positivist conceptions of historiographical reason and evidence. He was addressing, quote, the moral duty of the historical profession, after all. And so what was paramount wasn't so much theoretical credulity, although that is important, as practical or pragmatic tenability in the sense of effectively bringing people to identify with the triumphs and tribulations of humanity as a whole. Here myth comes into the picture. Any such existential identification is tied to myth as the precognitive background for historical perception. And so McNeill saw the need for direct hermeneutical engagement with myth. He termed this approach to historiography myth history. My screen is blocking that, but anyway, it's on the screen, myth history. This unabashedly includes a fundamental element of mythopoesis, what we might even call therapeutic mythopoesis, and it can be helpfully related to Hans Blumenberg's account of myths. With Blumenberg in mind, I'll just define myth slightly further as an epistemically neutral narrative. Oops. Hitting buttons accidentally here. That provides the sense or significance that endows experience with a normatively valenced orientation. This is a functional view, and it comes down to the social imaginary institution of a particular landscape of significance, precisely as the definite environmental niche that humans lack biologically. Such landscapes are pre-scientific life worlds, and mythic narrative forms their institutive urdaxa, or bedrock presuppositions. Contrary to common preconceptions, which locate myth in the distant past, in this view, mythic horizons are ongoing and dynamic. Myth's function of providing significance is fulfilled in and through its reception and adaptation to present needs, what Blumenberg called work on myth, or what McNeill called the care and repair of public myth. And it is thus always subject to a particular kind of critical scrutiny. As epistemically neutral, myth may be, strictly speaking, unfalsifiable, but myth can still be debated rationally with regard to its plausibility vis-a-vis the results of empirical science and the normative defensibility of the values it expresses. Connecting the dots further, I would just say this is what a life world phenomenology does, that it is, at least initially, work on myth in the sense of bringing a creative fidelity to bear upon the pre-given mythic horizonality. Phenomenology does not stand apart from the historicity of the life world, and it is realized in the same way through a generative gesture that projects this horizonality anew in such a way as to give shape to the future sense of the world in a normatively preferable way. A turn to nature as such reflects the view that it would be normatively preferable not to be limited to a particular life world, to put it into question, and to explore a possible deeper common ground. This involves a sort of anthropological reduction that would aim to answer Kant's so-called fourth question, what is a human being, in a rigorously non-teleological way by telling a pragmatically compelling paleoanthropological story about human origins in pre-human nature. This can be done in different ways, but ideally it would be done in a way that reestablishes the openness of the future by detaching it from the problematic teleology of progress implicit in the Enlightenment's dichotomization of nature and history. This is the salience of the radical historicization involved in the idea of nature history. It's methodologically implied by the project of phenomenology as I'm construing it, and it's what deep history aspires to do. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about that in any detail, and I won't. I'll just say, of Christian's book, Origin Story, that it's surely a work of myth history. It would never be called Origin Story otherwise. Teeming with scientific tidbits, the mythic narrative itself is one of gradual and then exponentially increasing emergent complexity that culminates in the so-called Anthropocene as an ambivalent situation that includes marvelous achievements, but which also portends potential catastrophe. Humans today are thus tasked with a heroic quest, the aim of which is to avoid the catastrophe while preserving the achievements. The narrative is supposed to help us prepare for that task. But other than perhaps drumming up global support for aggressive measures on climate change, it's not clear how. It's only at the end of the story, which is otherwise about the contingent unfolding of nature history through fortuitous constellations of Goldilocks conditions, that the process has a goal. It's as if the line between nature and history isn't really blurred at all, but just at the original threshold of harmonization itself were shifted forward to the present. In terms of subject-object interaction, there's no sense of dialectical participation in the main part of the story. Even the discussion of human evolution is standardly neo-Darwinian in a way that we can't relate to as historical agents. And so the heroism that Christian calls for is in no way prefigured. The problem is not that his account of deep history is mythic, but that its narrative doesn't tell an appropriately dialectical story and thus ultimately fails to disrupt the prevailing teleology of progress and default recourse to Promethean agency from above. We'll be coming back to that. Turning to Merleau-Ponty. We have then his belated recognition that a phenomenological revisioning of Marxist humanism on a corporeal basis calls for a deep historical investigation that would, by fitting organismic biology into a broader evolutionary and developmental story, disclose prototypical traces of historical agency in nature, understood non-anthropocentrically. It is important to point out that for Merleau-Ponty was able to do this because he had come to believe that the objects of phenomenological investigation need not be given, but can be considered as expressive and hence approached indirectly through their given expressions. This is how the reduction need not be as incomplete as he had previously thought. This is particularly important with regard to questions concerning nature and totality, the most important of which is the idea of organism itself, the status of which Merleau-Ponty suggested may be the central question of philosophy. Following Goldstein, Merleau-Ponty regarded the organism or organismicity as a unity of signification, the normative immanence of which must be understood not positively, but prospectively. Whereas he had earlier tried to do this in connection with an overarching historical totality possessed of a logic that allowed for, but was unperturbed by, local contingencies, he now turns this around to disclose a logic within contingency, a dialectical logic immanent in the local or micro events of biological materiality that prefigures what he saluted unreservedly as Marx's key insight, namely that there is, quote, a historical rationality immanent in human life. At root, the idea is to show that organismic nature is more the ground than the antithesis of freedom, and in this way get past the antinomy between causality and finality in history by seeing how it plays out biologically. Now, Merleau-Ponty does this through consideration of the work of numerous researchers. I'll just touch on a few highlights that serve to support the claim that there is a dialectical reciprocity between behavior and ontogeny, that through its behavior, the organism plays an active role in its own morphogenesis. So, for instance, Merleau-Ponty considered George Coghill's investigations into the embryogenetic and physical development of the larval salamander axolotl. Coghill showed experimentally that the neural and anatomical development of the axolotl occurs in conjunction with the motor behaviors that development itself makes possible. The mature organism is an integrated and articulated whole, the unity and parts of which develop according to immanent possibilities. In particular, the axolotl's initially distinct sensory and motor systems come together and develop in and through the movements whereby it learns to swim, and the development of the axolotl's legs is in the same way inseparable from eventual walking behavior. Walking grasps, as Merleau-Ponty put it, quote, the immanence of what is going to follow in that which has already begun. The organism is an emergent totality, the development of which points to immanent possibilities that exceed its immediate functioning and physiological state. well beyond the ken of mechanism, organismic development can thus be seen as a matter of endogenous self-transformation that anticipates the future. As Merleau-Ponty glossed the point, quote, the embryo is not simple matter, but matter which refers to the future. And further, quote, in virtue of its endogenous initiative, the organism traces out what its future life will be. It sketches out its milieu, Umwelt. It contains a project in reference to the whole of its life. The reference to Umwelt points to what Merleau-Ponty drew from Jacob von Uxküll, in particular the view of the organism as a melody that sings itself, something it does in connection with its Umwelt, as a specific milieu of events generated through the organism's own behavior that solicits the notes, so to speak, of the melody. The behavior and Umwelt of an organism are tightly interwoven and dialectically responsive. Merleau-Ponty put it, the Umwelt is the world implied by the movement of the animal and which regulates the animal's movement by its own structure. The relation is one of significance, not causality. And Merleau-Ponty even suggests that animal Umwelten represent a kind of proto-symbolic pre-culture, his term. And in this way, we catch a more expansive glimpse of the self-organization of life. In one of the most arresting images in the Nature lecture notes, Merleau-Ponty gave the following simile. The unfurling of the animal is like a pure wake that is related to no boat. Earlier, in recognizing the shortcomings of humanism, Merleau-Ponty had said that one explains nothing by man. Here we see that it's likewise with any substantial or otherwise determinate conception of animal. In this, there's an accentuation of biological contingency that pairs naturally with a boosted sense of autonomy. And Merleau-Ponty noted how this could be extended and applied to human life, such as to suggest some kind of creative biological agency. To shed further light on this, Merleau-Ponty also considered the work of Arnold Gesell and Catherine Amatruda concerning dynamic morphology, which served to emphasize that an organism's morphogenetic trajectory is not pre-given, not an innate code or program that is then instantiated, but emerges in the environmentally embedded development itself and is mediated and regulated by it. As David Morris put it, quote, development is a dynamically complex process that first of all develops the developmental pathways that will be followed. The organism's present state may envelop its future, but it does so across a normative gap or divergence. There is contingency or plasticity in morphogenesis for this reason. In generalizing what Goldstein had called the basic biological law, whereby organisms come to terms with their environments in a dynamic, gestalt theoretically optimal way, and taking seriously the claims of scientists like Edward Russell and Adolf Portman, for example, that animal life manifests an existential value, a theme, or a style. What Merleau-Ponty emphasized with regard to organismic development was an inherent negativity. There was an operative non-being or indeterminate absence in the organism. This is the immanence of the non-givenness of its future. And this is what Merleau-Ponty was alluding to in claiming that, quote, it is not a positive being, but an interrogative being that defines life. In an important sense, the organism is temporally ahead of itself. This is an expressive phenomenological claim, and it could not be made otherwise. If it's compelling, then it makes a good case for taking such an approach to nature, or at any rate to animality, and for regarding organismic development, construed as recursive structural self-transformation through the actualization of immanent norms, as offering a compelling model of the relation between a compelling model of the relation between present and future in the human case. This view extends Engels' original intention to identify dialectical principles in nature. But unlike his actual account, which eschewed biology, this one does radically disrupt the standard Cartesian or positivist picture in a way that allows for a dialectical ontology that would, or at least could, have the sort of implications for social theory that Engels presumably intended. Or never mind Engels, it could have the sorts of implications that we want if we want to take seriously the idea of immanent social critique, that is, social critique that is not moralistic, but finds its normative basis in the critiqued social formation in a way that doesn't pose an uptake problem. There may be other ways, but to locate the requisite normativity in embodied and intracorporeal behavior is an auspicious possibility. I will come back to this. First, though, I just want to consider the epistemic status of this claim and pick up on what I had said near the outset about a cautionary tale. Broadly, what Merleau-Ponty was trying to do was to make sense of the experimental phenomena of biological science. This is meant to provide the best overall description of the available data, even if it does not purport to be explanatory, and hence not to be true or false in that scientific sense. Although Merleau-Ponty would have likely balked at putting it this way, I would say that this developmental conception of organismicity amounts to a scientifically informed mythic narrative, the sui generis horizon of epistemically neutral significance that would shape the perceptual background for science and politics. It's consistent with the science he consulted, but as work on myth, I think he meant it to push on certain points in a way to revise and move beyond the orthodoxic limits of his particular life world's horizons, to de-dichotomize history and nature. Now, the lines of Merleau-Ponty's thinking here are also consistent with more recent work done under the banner of dialectical biology, evolutionary developmental biology, and work on the extended evolutionary synthesis. In all this, what is at issue is a challenge to neo-Darwinism that would limit the evolutionary role of genetics by interweaving it with organismic and environmental factors. It would also seem to be consistent with contemporary interest in epigenetics, that is, the controversial claim that processes of gene regulations can be affected and altered by environmental changes, which has been taken to suggest a possible rehabilitation of the idea of soft inheritance or the transgenerational inheritance of acquired characteristics, an idea strongly associated with Lamarckism. For reasons of length, I have omitted discussion of questions directly concerning heredity and evolution. Merleau-Ponty certainly had criticisms of neo-Darwinism as he saw it, but it's also the case that up to around that time, Darwinian and Mendelian theory were still not very warmly embraced by biologists in France, and Lamarckian tendencies retained a foothold. And this is reflected in Merleau-Ponty. What I'm interested in here is the more specific episode typically referred to as the Lysenko Affair. In a nutshell, this was the situation that came to a head in the late 1940s, in which the Soviet Union officially denounced and liquidated genetic science in favor of the scientifically inferior, but politically and ideologically preferred neo-Lamarckian theories of an agronomist named Trofim Lysenko. This led to the Zhdanovist theory of two sciences, bourgeois versus proletarian, in which the neo-Darwinian modern synthesis was cast as an ideological ruse of capitalism. Now, Lysenko's work specifically had to do with increasing agricultural yields, but the broader implications were patent. Human evolutionary progress could be accelerated through social engineering, perhaps the most massive expression of Promethean humanism one could imagine. Now, this is relevant for two reasons. First, accusations of neo-Lysenkoism are regularly made in contemporary discussions of epigenetics, along with other politically charged scientific questions, including climate change, designating the Anthropocene, and neuroplasticity. The Lysenko Affair is typically taken as an execrable example of the dangers of political interference in science, and the specter of Lysenko is hauled out when it appears that politics is trumping scientific autonomy. Second, the Lysenko Affair ramified internationally, and for various reasons, it happened to take a particularly pronounced form in France. Merleau-Ponty was there, in the thick of it, and although, as far as I know, there is no extant record of his thoughts about it, it is simply inconceivable that he would not have been deeply interested in it. I suspect that Merleau-Ponty might have felt at least somewhat torn, as many did, as did many others, and it should be explored as an important event in the development of his thought. For now, I'm just interested in what might be said about Merleau-Ponty's approach to nature in light of its dating from shortly after the heated debates of the Lysenko Affair, which dealt with very closely related issues. I suspect that Merleau-Ponty would not have regarded Lysenkoism as fundamentally a problem of heavy-handed political meddling in a process that is otherwise normatively neutral, but rather as an extreme case of normal science, but as situated in different life worlds with different experiential horizons. That's where the real action is. And so in general, the solution would be, of course, to take a phenomenological approach that brackets or suspends the competing scientific claims and try to resolve the confirmation biases concerning them by articulating a broader background horizonality. That's roughly what he undertook to do. But to be clear, this is not to do science better. It's not to do science at all, but something else. Now, we may want to just call it ontology, but here I'll just remark that my interpretation of this in terms of myth as an intervention into what we might call the mythico-political that sketches out a new horizon of significance is not inconsistent with that and makes good exegetical sense. Engaging in myth is surely fraught with numerous risks, which calls for its own cautionary tale. But episodes like the Lysenko Affair show that sidestepping questions of myth may be even riskier. And then the real kind of conclusion. Finally, what's interesting about Merleau-Ponty's thinking about nature is how, in reconfiguring the outer horizon of experience and of political experience in particular, it enables us to see immanent social critique and the possibility of imminent social transformation in a new light, specifically in an embodied light. The idea of imminent social transformation is supposed to sound paradoxical. How can something be imminent? How can something imminent be transformative? Well, this is just what we can now see in nature, so that's not a problem. But how does this transpose into history? So recall Christian's origin story. This offers a kind of nature history, but not a dialectical one. We can perhaps see history as nature, but not the other way. It's as if there's been no history up to the present, that it's been all nature, but that now we need to make history big time in order to avoid catastrophe. This calls for a seemingly superhuman kind of heroic agency, which would be inevitably Promethean. Conversely, in Merleau-Ponty's story, we have a more thoroughly dialectical sense of nature history, and one that crystallizes in human embodiment as the liminal frontier, the cutting edge of nature as historical self-transformation. The metabolism between nature and history is something we live. As organisms, we embody normativity, not just biological norms, that's not so interesting, but social norms, inasmuch as these are sedimented within our corporeality as habitual predispositions. This is sometimes called ethical know-how. And Merleau-Ponty's mythic narrative invites us to see this as natural. And it leads to a rather different sense of heroism. In contrast to the moral deliberation that we would need to engage in at the end of Christian's story, Consider the scenario of someone who spontaneously jumps onto the subway tracks to rescue someone who's fallen, and who afterwards says something like, I didn't think, I had no choice, I just did what I had to do. It's a common self-report. Everybody applauds, but why praise an instance of necessity? It's puzzling. I think that the object of this approbation is the fact that the heroic agent literally incarnates social norms with which we identify. The fact that her predispositionality obviated her need to deliberate and choose. Such cases offer a crucial phenomenological disclosure of the material locus of subject-object exchange. They thereby show how historically transformative agency could be understood from below in non-Promethean embodied terms. How the normative grounds of immanent critique can have a real bite, and how we might be able to ground a notion of historical progress that is not teleological in any problematically macro sense. Although it can sound weird, it's my final paragraph, although it can sound weird to say that we should reconnect with our organismicity, this is ultimately easier to relate to than Christian's account, to which our historicity remains external. I'll just put it this way. We must, it is said, be the change. Absolutely. But if this injunction seems paradoxically unclear or dauntingly demanding, then it is important to recognize how it may already be true predispositionally. We may be looking for the resources of historical agency in the wrong places. Our corporeality may be further ahead than we think. I'm not certain there's any direct application of this, but as a heuristic insight, such is, in a nutshell, the take-home message from Merleau-Ponty's work on nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan, for a terrific talk. Very, very thought-provoking indeed. I would remind people to please put their questions in the question and answer section, and I will read them out so that they will go into the recording and then can be used later. I would also just like to add something we forgot to mention at the outset, which is that this session is being co-sponsored by the Vancity Office of Community Engagement at SFU. Here is the first question from an anonymous attendee. Everybody's anonymous, it turns out. I wonder, it seems a little bit daunting. But here, you can follow along if you like in the Q&A section, Bryan, and other people, I assume, as well. But I'll read it nonetheless. First question. In reference to Uxel, would you say that Merleau-Ponty objects to us humanizing other animals? In brackets, we do them no service to be associated with us.
We're gonna one at a time. Yeah, okay.
I think so. They seem different enough that it might be confusing to take more than one question.
Yeah, sure.
And we have a good half hour.
I'll just have to take partly, I guess, of what you might mean, anonymous attendee, about humanizing other animals. And I think he would object to that. We don't want to, as far as he has some issues with much of what Uxel says, but as I was trying to just tease out of the Umwelt idea is something that he thinks takes great importance. And that would sort of, couldn't but be taken in a direction that, bespeaks the specificity of animals, different animals, different Umwelt. And so as far as I can tell, I don't think he would object to us humanizing other animals. I think he would object to that. And we might think of humans as, and there's a general sense. That's partly why I like to, in his lectures, he often used the term animality, which is fine enough, but I was trying to be more specific in speaking of organismicity. We can speak of a certain, general commonality there, but that's not to humanize them. That is just to put our, to recognize what connects us, the kinship, so to speak, that we have with animals. But I think, yes, he would object to humanizing animals.
Okay. Another question here. The second question would like you to expand on the notion in Merleau-Ponty that human consciousness is one type or style of behavior amongst many others in the animal world. How does our perception and behavior, I take that to be human perception and behavior, unite us or divide us within nature? Bryan?
Yes, no, I'm just reading the question and thinking.
Okay, I thought I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
No. I might have been whispering to myself as I was reading the question. I'm trying to parse out the question a little bit here. Merleau-Ponty's argument that one type among others in the animal world. So, I think, is this question, if I'm reading it correctly, something to the effect of, human consciousness as kind of emergent property that does not establish some sort of essential difference from animals. I think the second part of the question, how does perception and behavior unite us, divide us within nature? At a certain level, he can be using those terms as he does, and he finds scientific researchers doing likewise, using those terms across, let's say, the animal spectrum. So those terms, especially behavior is understood to be something that's meant to be kind of a non-dualistic, especially a non-dualistic, but his own understanding of perception, likewise. Sometimes I think some of the nuances in the question might get lost when it's in more an abbreviated form here.
I think that's true, Bryan. It can be very hard to ask a question in a couple of sentences about something like this.
Yeah.
But I understand this question as being about whether Merleau-Ponty's account of human perception kind of puts us in tandem with other animals, as opposed to the kind of classic attempt to look at human consciousness as a way of distinguishing us from other animals. I think that's what it's getting at.
I see. Yes, probably. He would. Human perception is human perception. So we can think of a more general sense of it, but in as much as perception, perceptual experience, as he thinks about it in terms of a more immediate encounter or engagement with the world. If it's true what we were just talking about in terms of Umwelten and different animals and different specific contexts. Literally, there's a literal sense that they inhabit different worlds. Their perception is different accordingly. We don't see what the dog sees or the bee sees. So, perception is going to differ, and behavior likewise as well. The notion of a style, though, was very important in turn that could apply, again, sort of generally in different cases, different animals. Something that actually kind of addresses issues about specificity in the sense of species. There's a style, and that individuals and phenotypic individuals, exhibit or live out a certain style, rather than thinking about, say, species being, just to use a term like that, as being somehow uniform and embedded genetically and in a roughly deterministic way.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, partly what at least the main point I was trying to draw out, and other points can be drawn out from Merleau-Ponty's work on nature, is that, there is an appreciable similarity in the sense that it's, significant, right? When we think about, the significance for us of our natural being, the significance for us of our kinship with animals, the significance for us of, the facts, whatever they are exactly, of our evolutionary history are significant when we think about just ordinary questions of what we do or larger questions of political action and so on. And that there is enough there, that there's something meaningful, right? Some people might think we can simply dismiss it, that it's completely irrelevant and lost in the past and cut off from any present day concerns. But obviously he doesn't want to do that. So certainly is in the sense of, incarnating that kind of negativity, that life, basically, you want to say, maybe just put it in terms of life, as life being a matter of that sort of negativity, this sort of, which in effect, is this normative. And there are, norms within. That's true, and that's the most important point here, and how those things kind of shape our behavior. Of course, it takes as many different forms as there are different animals and species, but at least at that level, it's a commonality.
Okay. I inadvertently skipped a question. I'm rather new to this technology, and it may be that you've given an answer to this previous question in your current the answer you just gave, but let me read it anyway and see if there's anything you want to add. Would you say that Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger both argue against the Cartesian mechanistic view of nature as it exists in modernity?
I think so. Now, it's not a talk on Heidegger, and in fact, I'm sometimes surprised when I try to think, when was the last time I picked up a book from Heidegger? It's been a while. But I think the answer is probably yes. It was basically looked like a yes/no question, so I might be able to get away with that.
Fair enough. I do think the elaboration on that was given in the previous question. Another question here then. Would you say that Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on embodiment as the commonality between all nature is in danger of being lost in today's technological/digital reality, and with the ongoing mechanistic acceleration of technology?
I would have to say no. Sorry, would you say it's danger of being lost? Well, maybe I don't think it could be lost. I guess that would be the first line of an answer. There may be dangers to something, perhaps our embodied well-being. I'm not sure it could go so far as somehow losing embodiment. Maybe I got to see the question. I mean, what's the danger of being lost? Embodiment or Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on it? Let's see. It made it sound like there's a possible loss of the kind of embodiment he's talking about. Certainly the forms are embodiment, I suppose, in the virtual world and, digital technology and all of the things that are mentioned right there. Must mean something. I haven't done enough work or thought about that exactly. I guess I tend to be focused on the preliminary aspects of the question, but and I just I don't really see
right
how we would exist otherwise than embodied, and I don't think the fundamental dynamics of that could change. It's certainly true. And Merleau-Ponty, especially in his earlier work, in the Phenomenology of Perception, is quite concerned with forms of pathology, pathological forms of cases in different ways. We can think of pathological forms of embodiment, and that might be the direction it could be going in, where we think that there's a certain kind of deformation, if you like, and I don't mean anything mean-spirited in negative terms like that, Merleau-Ponty, was very, in terms of the most celebrated cases that he discussed, or the most, the case of the patient named Schneider, who was a patient of Goldstein and Gelb and so on. Remember with Ponty's actually his whole emphasis isn't so much to, just emphasize so much pathology. It's more a matter of plasticity, right? The fact that that particular patient had very serious cerebral injuries, but was actually able to pull it together. He wasn't the same person quite, but he lived well enough. I mean, anyways, there was the fact that he recovered was what was most important there, actually, right? So we could then, we'd be thinking probably in terms like that. If there is something about our world, our Umwelt or our life world, that changes in these ways, is increasing digital stuff, et cetera, and so on, that I could imagine, but I don't think I could spell it out, lead to what we might describe as kind of pathologies of our embodiment, which would be, holistically, the dynamics remain the same. It's just that we need to come to terms with a very different world, which may not have the same kind of dialectical responsiveness that other contexts might have.
Yeah, it seems clear that we're going to have to remain embodied. And we're embodied now, even though we're having a very different kind of meeting than if we were in a lecture hall downtown. So we remain embodied, but certainly in a very different way. So the significance of that, it could be pathological, but maybe not, right? Anyway, that's just me. Here we have a question from a person with a name, which is nice.
Jack.
From Jack Reynolds.
From far away.
Part of your description of phenomenology and perception remains conservative in some respects around the human, but Merleau-Ponty has a political radicality at that time. As Merleau-Ponty becomes more radical ontologically in the way that you're outlining today, he seems to be less radical politically, say in his late essays. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Jack. When I said something, and I was almost going to revise it on the fly, I said something about, how his account of embodiment was, I think I said more conservative, more a force of conservatism than revolution or something like that. And I was going to kind of switch it to say something like as much or any, but it doesn't matter. Partly just in general, not so much for Merleau-Ponty in particular, embodiment, there is something, body's not normally a politically radical thing, basically. When we're thinking in particular about our, embeddedness in a particular life world. But it's partly that, kind of the very issues, I guess, that you're then touching on, that I think lead Merleau-Ponty along the path that he took. So in part, we could bring in the figure of Tran Duc Thao, a Vietnamese student who studied in France, very brilliant, close to Merleau-Ponty during the war, shortly after the war, who was responsible to a big extent for trying to bring both phenomenology and Marxism together, but also in connection with questions of colonialism. And that is partly related to that, the limitations or why we might speak of Merleau-Ponty's earlier kind of embodiment as conservative comes out most sharply there. Right? Basically, Tran was making arguments at the time. He came to realize basically something like this: the French life world could not recognize the possibility of an independent Vietnam. Right? That's partly, so if you're speaking of embodiment in that context, it's going to be conservative. And that's partly what can motivate him, Merleau-Ponty, to try to go further. Because I think initially, along with other people, he basically thought, the French life world was the thing, But the colonial question brought out fairly clearly that is not so. So someone like Tran, of course, eventually went to Vietnam thinking basically the same thing that Merleau-Ponty had thought about France. Tran thought about the life world, the situation in Vietnam, that basically that was going to solve the philosophical problems, the actual movement of national liberation. But it didn't. It didn't really work out, and Tran had a miserable life after he went back there. And Merleau-Ponty was probably aware of that. But I think that must be connected to the things you were referring to, his later, unlike so many other people, often the people that Tony Judd was really, down on. Merleau-Ponty didn't kind of take or adopt the more extreme positions with regard to the colonial questions. I think he was aware, it's partly to repeat the same error, right? Thinking basically within the limitations of different life worlds, and that ideally he was just more interested in trying to solve those problems by doing what he's doing here, trying to work out a more general basis, working at nature as sort of the life world itself, and work out that kind of ontological implications. So I'm trying to find the rest of the question. I can't recall how you posed it. I don't see it anymore. That would be the connection, I think. So that if we can work out a conception, a phenomenological conception of embodiment that's actually rooted, say, in nature rather than this or that life world, even if those other life worlds are radicalizing on the colonial question, that would be, I think he thought, kind of the more long-term approach. So, when he was thinking about whether it was Algeria or Madagascar or other questions, that makes sense.
We've got 3 more questions here lined up, and we've got about 11 minutes to 6:30. So that. Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll take those 3 questions and then call it a day, if that's acceptable. A question from Morgan Young, who is an associate of the Institute, as asking you to comment on Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment and the relationship between myth and enlightenment there, and bring that into relationship with your initial remarks on myth and myth history.
Thank you. Yeah, I did remember, I think maybe in the abstract, I made a reference to this, but I didn't in the paper itself. It's actually a good way of, I think, drawing out the main point that I was trying to make there. Their line, or the claim that they make and that they elaborate about enlightenment reverting to mythology, or seeing the connection there. I mean, I'm taking that, and I think they partly did, as seeing, a kind of, a bond, a relationship, different aspects of rationality, something like that. And, basically they were, in terms of the dialect, in terms of the problems they were seeing, which were so basically overdetermined by the use of myth, or the apparent use of myth, by Nazi Germany and fascism, say, maybe in general, that it was overdetermined by that. I think that there's a line of thought in what they say, which can allow for a very different interpretation of that sentiment, that enlightenment reverts to mythology, in a very positive way. And that's actually what I'm trying to do, to show that, enlightenment, enlightened about itself, comes to see that there are ineliminable mythic horizons, that it's not. This is the thing. We need to kind of disentangle their analysis of enlightenment and its relation to myth from it's being overdetermined by their correct, hostility to fascist myth, and to recognize, there is a sense of myth in general. Sometimes they have phrases in there like genuine myth or something, I can't remember, but they don't develop that. Like, they're very much, I think, determined by the problems of fascist myth. Ernst Cassirer, writing around the same time, is in a very similar situation, I think, the myth of the state. Right. You don't really see, the fact that myth is more kind of ubiquitous, say, that is always a feature of our experience, that have mythic horizons, and that therefore, recognizing this would be a moment of great enlightenment, and it would have then implications that we ought to engage with it in a certain way. That's kind of what I was then, that we do this. It's not most people freak out about myth and think, of course, it's a bad thing. We don't want to talk about that, let alone go there. But I could call it something else, give it another name that people might not be so frightened off by. But I think there is in Horkheimer and Adorno there, sort of the material, the elements, for a very different account that would be positive along these lines, which may have some connections with some of the work I was referring to from people like Blumenberg, who are otherwise rather different. Blumenberg is much more connected to Husserl, but that's another problem for people like Adorno and Horkheimer, especially at that time, was their inability, or rather, well, they couldn't see Husserl or phenomenology really as a critical discourse at that time. Now we can see it more easily. There's so much more to go on. The Crisis wasn't even published yet. So, it's very hard for them to see how phenomenology, but it's through phenomenology that we get this fuller glimpse, this fuller appreciation of the role, the place of myth in our thinking. And then we can kind of see that this actually, as I was trying to say with regard to the issues around Lysenkoism and so on, just very important, to be able to make that differentiation between like scientific reason and sort of the broader terms in which we approach that. So I want to be able to draw out a positive connection with Adorno and Horkheimer, and that basically means, kind of a rereading of what they do that extracts it from what was perfectly natural in 1944, was, of course, to be overly preoccupied with fascist myths and to see myth in more general terms in the contemporary world.
Okay. A question from Mahdi Ganbari. Do you think that Merleau-Ponty's approach to nature and normativity will make Husserl's epoche unnecessary? Since for Husserl, the distinction between the natural attitude and the transcendental attitude is essential for talk about normativity and universality.
Epoche. I guess, there's different things you might about what the epoche means or entails. What this is still, as far as I know, discussed and debated, and different views may be taken. If we mean in general, the movement or the gestures, the methodological gestures of phenomenological reduction, then no, I don't think it makes it unnecessary. I do think that it may change, or rather, in order to, I partly address this a little bit, but of course I couldn't do it in detail, in order to approach nature phenomenologically, if we've, first of all, come to the view that such a thing is something we want to do, then doing so would involve a kind of reduction, right? Which I'm going to just, think here, includes the epoche. If you mean different things by those things, and then that can change the question, but it would be. I think the biggest thing, though, is that it's not simply a bracketing out sense, or the suspension of, not simply that, because what I was actually implying here, I think it's actually quite controversial, I suppose. To speak about, if it is indeed the case that we're kind of going, beyond, I think kind of radicalizing the approach to the life world phenomenology approach, that definitely means partly bracketing out things, claims of science and other sorts of things and so on, but also something more kind of almost positive, almost as if we're projecting something, right? Kind of it's almost like projecting, say with Husserl, the Heraclitean flux or something. I mean, at least allowing that could be our starting point. In a way, and here I'm having kind of Blumenberg in mind here, thinking in effect, our life world begins with a generative gesture where we actually bracket something out. There's something that reminds me of Alfred Schutz's idea of what he called, remember, the epoche of the natural attitude. It's kind of the opposite thing, where we actually, form, project certain horizons that kind of enclose us. We kind of bracket things out in order to shape, say, the natural attitude in a given life world context. And partly we want to undo that. And that's why the sense of approaching nature and what the reduction could mean in a generative sense, as I was discussing, will look a lot different. It's partly, in fact, returning, say, or allowing the return of a broader thing. So it's a little bit, the content of it, the nature of the thing, of the epoche or the reductive move will certainly appear differently if we want to go about the kinds of things that I was talking about Merleau-Ponty doing there. So I don't think it would make it unnecessary. I think it might change the nature of it.
Okay, well, this will be our last question. And it relates somewhat to the previous two questions, but focuses in on the concept of expression. So you may want to make one or two comments focusing in that way. From Tyler Gastiger, could you expand on the concept of expression and how it contributes to overcoming the incompleteness of the phenomenological reduction? And how does this connect to your understanding of myth?
So Merleau-Ponty's conception of expression, it's really, the problem, there's a problem, as I just, alluded to it in passing, partly, is, problem, questions of totality, of wholes, things that are meaningful in our experience, but not strictly speaking given as such. There's all kinds of interesting and important questions that would fall into that category, and it's just a little bit too much for phenomenology. I have nothing to say. So one way, Merleau-Ponty thinks, well, this is the sense we can take them as expressive, or he talks about expressivity, and try to approach them in that way. So it's a kind of indirect. It certainly puts some pressure on some of the original ideas of, phenomenological givenness, of course, but anyways, those are long past. And, so the sense of overcoming what he had called the incompleteness, when he was talking about the incompleteness, how it's not, sort of possible, fully to, whatever, bracket out everything, including in particular what he was thinking, our own embodiment and the underlying operative intentionalities that make phenomenologizing itself possible. We could now do this, right? It just allows us, so long as we can see, this is basically what it would mean, so long as we can see doing it in that way as still faithful to the original intentions of description, then, we could do that. And now we can describe other things that were previously not given. And that's how we could deal with some of the incompleteness of the reduction. How does this connect to myth? How does this connect to myth? Trying to think if there's some shorter kind of answer, but then it will take me. How does this? There's lots of ideas concerning my understanding of myths swirling around in my head, and I'm trying to figure out which ones I should be connecting this to. I'm not. How does this connect? Wish you could elaborate on just what you might mean by that. Is there a particular point in something I said that prompted that second question, Tyler, or?
I don't see a mechanism for him to add to this.
Well, add a second question. Okay, thank you. Perhaps I have in mind what.
Another question. Yeah, the same.
Yeah. Well, it says, and
I should read this. Tyler has added to his question then. Perhaps I have in mind what Bloch calls anticipatory consciousness.
Let's see. I've read some Bloch, but I know the thought. Not so much thinking about that, I don't think. It's basically just to say, let's just maybe back it up. I'll just say, thinking about myth, what I was saying in the previous response to the previous question, that's kind of, illimitable horizons, sort of the outermost horizons, which we might think of it like when I say, the Urdox of the life world and so on, which then have, I think, a kind of narrative structure. That these things, form the background. That's kind of, the presence of myth or what myth is doing. So it would be the case. Here maybe is how I'll start making the connection. It would be the case if we're doing a phenomenology along the lines of this, expressivity, that we're trying to, address some of those matters or questions and so on that escaped our phenomenological scrutiny considered more narrowly. This is going to be informed, as all things would be, by those outer horizons, right? I suppose we might say that, that's going to be the case. And you got another follow-up here. You going to read that, Ian?
Yes, I should. Does myth, as defining the outermost horizons, determine the content of expressive phenomenology?
Excellent question, because in effect, that's what that's the general idea of what I was just getting there. I think that when we're doing it, those horizons, would that's what horizons would do. Well, determine is not the right word, but condition, we might say. Would condition the content. So that's partly the idea. And if you like in Merleau-Ponty, a kind of hyper-reflexive recursiveness here, the fact that we do want to be attentive to the mythic horizons of experience, recognizing phenomenologically the role that they play in life in general, but in phenomenological work as well. That's what we would want to be attentive to. So yes, that would be a connection. I don't think it's the kind of connection you might have initially been kind of looking for, but it's that would be, and presumably given that connection, this would hopefully then, if we took it up, if we worked on it, explored it, and so on, come to see how those changes, that kind of, as I was calling and following Blumenberg work on myth, that when we're doing that specific kind of work, how that would then reflect in what we do, possibly what others do as well, right? In terms of altering generally kind of the horizons of our historical perception, and then all that falls within that.
That's terrific. That clarifies for me a lot of what you were saying about myth before. Is how we can speak about the limits of our own life world, which we have to do in some sense, but of course we can't capture it in knowledge. Anyway, well, thanks very much for a really terrific talk and a lovely response to questions. Thank you to all the participants, and please join me in thanking Bryan for a lovely talk. And I hope to see you at future talks from the Institute for the Humanities, including you, Bryan.
Great.
Bye-bye for now.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks, Samir. Thank you, everybody.